winter evening in 1957, and somewhere in Ohio, or Missouri, or the flat farm country of eastern Nebraska, a man came in from work, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and sat down at the table with a catalog. It was the Montgomery Ward catalog, and by now it had that softened, thumbed quality that catalogs got in houses where people actually read them. His wife had gone through it for curtain fabric and a winter coat for the oldest girl. The children had gone through it for the toy pages, which they knew by heart, and now the man went through it for himself, slowly, the way a person reads something he has already decided about and is only working up the nerve to admit. He turned to the sporting goods pages. He had turned to them before. There was a shotgun there, a single-shot break-action gun, 410 bore, plain as a fence post, with a case-hardened frame, a rubber recoil pad, and an automatic ejector that threw the empty hull clear when the action opened. The name stamped on the barrel was Ward's Western Field. The model number was 10. The price was $25.90. $25.90 was not nothing. In 1957, the federal minimum wage in the United States was $1 an hour. A man on an automobile assembly line was making about $2.27 an hour. A skilled tool and die man near the top of the working trades made about $2.95 an hour, which came to $118 for a 40-hour week. So the shotgun on that page cost somewhere between a day and a half and 3 full days of a working man's life, depending on the man and depending on the work. He bought it anyway. Most of them did. And the reason was almost never the shooting. The reason was a boy who was turning 11 that spring, and who had been walking the fence rows behind his father for 2 seasons, already carrying nothing at all, and who was going to be handed something in a few months that he would remember for the rest of his life. That shotgun is very probably still alive. Not in a museum, in a closet, behind the coats, in a gun cabinet in a basement in Michigan, behind the seat of a truck in Tennessee. 70 years later, cleaned or not cleaned, it still opens, it still locks up tight, and it still shoots. And the store that sold it, the catalog that showed it, and very often the man who paid for it, are all gone. This is the story of Western Field, the gun empire Montgomery Ward built, sold by the million, and then buried. To understand the gun, a person first has to understand the store. And to understand the store, a person has to go back to a city that had recently burned down. In August of 1872, in Chicago, a traveling dry goods salesman named Aaron Montgomery Ward started a business with 2 other men and a total capital of $1,600. What he issued was not a catalog in the sense the word came to mean later. It was a single sheet of paper, roughly 8 inches by 12, a price list. It offered 163 items, and it explained how to order them. That single sheet is generally recognized as the first general merchandise mail order catalog in America. The idea was aimed squarely at a grievance. Ward had traveled the country roads as a salesman and had seen how rural people bought things. A farm family in Iowa or Kansas dealt with a single country store, and that store bought through a chain of middlemen, and every link took its cut, and the farmer at the end paid for all of them. He also took whatever the store happened to stock, because there was nothing else within a day's wagon ride. Ward's proposition was that a farmer could skip all of it, buy directly from Chicago, at Chicago prices, from a printed page, and have it come out on the railroad. It worked. The single sheet became 32 pages by 1874. By 1876, it ran 152 pages and listed 3,000 items. By 1883, it was 240 pages and 10,000 items. It reached farms that had no store, towns that had no bank, and counties that had no doctor. In a great many American households, it was the second book in the house, and the first one was the Bible. Then, in 1896, Richard Warren Sears put out a competing catalog, and the defining commercial rivalry of rural America began. By 1900, Ward's annual sales were about $8.7 million, and Sears about $10 million. close enough that neither company could ever relax. By 1904, Ward's was mailing 3 million catalogs a year, each weighing about 4 pounds. 4 pounds, 3 million times. That is the weight of an empire made out of paper. In 1908, the company opened a headquarters along the Chicago River with about 1.25 million square feet of floor space, and it stayed the headquarters until 1974. Before 1930, Ward's had built major distribution houses in Baltimore, Fort Worth, Kansas City, Oakland, Portland, and St. Paul. And then, in 1926, the company broke its own founding rule. It opened a retail store, an actual building a person could walk into, in Plymouth, Indiana. Within 2 years, there were 244 of them. By 1929, there were 531. By the late 1930s, Montgomery Ward was the largest retailer in the United States. So why did a company like that sell guns at all? Because in the America it served, a gun was not a specialty item. It was a tool, in the same category as an axe, a lantern, a set of harness, or a pair of boots. A shotgun kept hawks off the chickens and put rabbits and quail on the table in a period when the table was not always full. A .22 rifle dealt with rats in the corn crib. A deer rifle in November was, for a lot of families, arithmetic. 100 pounds of meat for the cost of a box of cartridges. And there was the plain problem of geography. Most of the country had no gun shop. There was no sporting goods store in a town of 400 people. What that town had was a mailbox and a railroad depot. And what came to the mailbox was the Montgomery Ward catalog. So Ward sold guns for the same reason it sold plows and washing machines and wedding rings. The people it served needed them, and nobody else was going to bring them out that far. Here's the fact that surprises almost everyone who owns one of these guns, and it needs to be said plainly and early. Montgomery Ward never made a firearm. Not one. Not ever. There was no Western Field factory, no Western Field engineering department, no building anywhere in America with that name on a smokestack. Western Field was a trade name owned by Montgomery Ward and Company of Chicago, stamped onto guns designed, tooled, and built by other companies, under contract to Ward's order. This was not a secret, and it was not a swindle. It was one of the most ordinary arrangements in American retail, and it worked like this. A gun maker's hardest problem has always been the factory itself. Barrel making machinery, receiver milling, stock duplicating, bluing tanks, heat treatment, proof testing, all of it is expensive to build and expensive to keep idle. A factory running at half capacity loses money every hour it stands still. What a gun maker wants most is a large guaranteed order placed months ahead, so the machines never stop. A retailer's problem is the opposite. Ward's had customers, millions of them, already reading the catalog, already trusting the name. What it lacked was product it controlled, so the two sides met in the middle. Ward's went to a manufacturer and committed to a very large quantity of a specific gun, often over multiple years. In exchange, it got three things. It got a price no ordinary retailer could get, because the order was enormous, and the factory could plan its whole year around it. It got the distributor's margin, because Ward's was both wholesaler and retailer. In a normal transaction, a gun left the factory, went to a distributor who marked it up, went to a dealer who marked it up again, and reached the customer carrying all three profits. Ward's collapsed that chain into one step, the same trick Aaron Montgomery Ward had built the company on in 1872, and it got its own name on the gun. That mattered more than people now assume. A farmer in a county with no gun shop had no way to evaluate a manufacturer he had never heard of. But he knew Montgomery Ward. He had bought a stove from Ward's and a coat from Ward's, and when something had been wrong, Ward's had made it right, because the company's entire business model depended on a stranger 3 states away trusting a printed page. The store's reputation was the warranty. The customer was not buying a gun maker. He was buying the store's promise, wrapped around steel and walnut. Ward's was hardly alone. Sears sold firearms under something like 18 different house names, the most famous being J.C. Higgins, with Ted Williams, Berkshire, and New England Arms among the others. Western Auto sold its guns as Revelation. J.C. Penney used its own numbers. Woolworth sold store-brand guns, and so did Gamble Skogmo. For roughly half a century, a very large share of the guns bought by ordinary Americans wore the name of a store rather than a gunmaker. Ward's used more than one such name. The mark Hawthorne also appears on Ward's sold guns, but the name that carried the company's firearms line, the one that ended up on hundreds of thousands of barrels and in millions of memories, was Western Field. And Ward's did one more thing, which is the reason collectors still argue on the internet at midnight about guns their grandfathers bought. Ward's did not simply stamp Western Field on the barrel and keep the manufacturer's model number. It assigned its own. Sometimes these were short, Model 10, Model 30, Model 72. Sometimes they were long strings of digits and letters that looked less like a model name than a warehouse code, because that is largely what they were. The result was that the true identity of the gun was buried. A man could own a Western Field for 50 years, hunt with it every autumn, hand it to his son, and never once find out who actually built it. Which brings us to the interesting part. Start with the single best documented example, because it sets the pattern for everything else. The gun-stamped Ward's Western Field, Model 10, is a Stevens Model 94B. It is not similar to a Stevens 94B. It is not based on one. It is one, off the same line, out of the same tooling, with a different name rolled onto it. And this is not folklore. The marking 94B is generally still there, on the receiver, where the factory put it. The manufacturer's own identification, left in place under the retailer's name. The Stevens 94B was in production from 1929 until 1969, a 40-year run, which by itself says something about the design. It was a break-open, single-shot, exposed hammer shotgun. The 410 bore guns were built on a smaller frame. The 16 and 20 gauge guns came with modified chokes. The 12 gauge used a larger frame. Even at that price, the gun carried a rubber recoil pad, a case-hardened frame, an automatic ejector, an opening lever that worked equally well for a right-handed or left-handed shooter, and a rebounding hammer, later changed to a half-cock arrangement. And there is a second layer to it. Stevens itself had not been an independent company since 1920, when Savage Arms bought the J. Stevens Arms and Tool Company. So a man in 1957 who bought a Western Field Model 10 from the Montgomery Ward catalog was buying a Stevens, which was really a Savage, sold to him by a department store. 3 names, 1 gun, and the buyer knew only the one that was not a gunmaker at all. That is the shape of the whole story. Now, the wider decoder. The National Firearms Museum of the National Rifle Association publishes a store brand crossover list, a reference document that matches store brand model numbers to the factory guns they actually were. It is the most useful single document in this entire subject, and for Western Field, it runs to roughly 200 entries. What follows comes from it. The dominant name in that list, by a very wide margin, is Mossberg. O.F. Mossberg and Sons began in March of 1919 in a rented loft on State Street in New Haven, Connecticut. Its founder, Oscar Frederick Mossberg, had been born in 1866 in Sweden, near the village of Svanskog in Värmland, and emigrated to the United States in 1886. He learned the trade at Ivar Johnson's Arms and Cycle Works in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, supervising the manufacture of revolvers and shotguns and patenting designs of his own. He was 53 and out of work when the Marlin Rockwell operation wound down after the First World War, and rather than look for a job, he started a company with his 2 sons, Ivor and Harold. Their first product was a 4-shot 22 caliber pocket pistol called the Brownie, of which roughly 37,000 were built between 1920 and 1932. The company is still owned by the same family, and it is the oldest family-owned firearms manufacturer in America. Mossberg built its reputation on exactly what Ward's needed: sound, unglamorous, mass-producible guns that worked. The partnership ran for decades. Here is what it produced. The Western Field Model 550A is a Mossberg Model 500A. The 550B is a 500B. The 550E is a 500E. The Western Field Models 505, 509, 524, 534, 536, and 539 are all Mossberg Model 500s. That matters more than any other single line in this video, because the Mossberg 500 is one of the most produced shotguns in American history, and it is still in production today. A man with a Western Field 550 in his closet is holding a Mossberg 500. The parts interchange because it is not a copy, it is the gun. Going further back, the Western Field 15 is a Mossberg 80. The 16 is a Mossberg 85. The 17 is a Mossberg 73. The 18 is a Mossberg 75. The Model 46 is a Mossberg 42. The Model 47 is a Mossberg 45A. The Model 150 is a Mossberg 183K. The 170 and 172 are Mossberg 3 95Ks. The 160 and 175 are Mossberg 385Ks. The 730 and 732 are Mossberg 8 10AHs. The 767 and 768 are Mossberg 800As. Then there are the long coded numbers, which are the ones that most often stop an owner cold. A gun marked 04M-4 89A is a Mossberg Model 50. 04M-2 18A is a Mossberg 73C. 04M-217A is a Mossberg 75C. 04M-214A is a Mossberg 85C. 04M-216A is a Mossberg 83C. 14M-215 or Indian A is a Mossberg 85. 14M-497B is a Mossberg M42. 24M-488A is a Mossberg 51. Collectors have long noticed the pattern sitting in plain sight in those numbers. The letter M keeps company with Mossberg. Numbers carrying the letters SB or SD keep company with Savage and Stevens. A gun marked 10-S, D247A, for instance, is a Stevens 94B with a T-Nite synthetic stock. It should be said honestly that no published Montgomery Ward document explaining that lettering has come to light. It is a pattern observed from the outside by people who have handled hundreds of these guns, not a code the company ever printed. But it is a real pattern, and it holds up remarkably well. Savage and Stevens account for the next large block. The Western Field Model 30 is a Stevens 520. The Model 36 is a Stevens 521. The Model 60 and the variant marked 60SB are Savage 6 20As. The Western Field Model 14 appears against the Savage 39A and the Savage 59A. And for anyone who assumed these were all cheap guns, the Western Field Model 710 is a Savage Model 110, a proper center-fire bolt-action deer rifle of a design that Savage has kept in its catalog, in one form or another, for well over half a century. Marlin is in the list too, and this is where the story gets a wrinkle. The Western Field Model 33 is a Marlin Model 336. So is the Western Field 740. The 336 is the classic American lever-action deer rifle, made in the millions, still made now. The Western Field Model 50 is a Glenfield 60, Glenfield being Marlin's own budget line. The Western Field Model 40 is a Marlin 101. The Model 45 is a Marlin 989 M2. There are smaller suppliers as well. Several Western field guns trace to the Noble Manufacturing Company. The 72 and the 472, both against the Noble Model 50. One Western Field 12 gauge. The 600ER is a Remington Sportsman 58, and at least one, the 151X, traces to Kessler. Now for the wrinkle. Around 1971, Ward's buyers went to Mossberg with an unusual request. They wanted Mossberg to design a lever-action rifle specifically for the Western Field label, to replace the Marlins they had been buying. Mossberg took the job, worked it up with an outside design group, and had a prototype ready inside the year. Ward's liked it and placed a large contract. That rifle became the Mossberg Model 472 and the Western Field. 771 and 772 are Mossberg 472 BAs, and 472 PCAs respectively. Read that again because it inverts the usual assumption about store brand guns. A department store's purchasing department did not merely order an existing rifle and put its name on it. It commissioned a new one. And that rifle then entered the manufacturer's own catalog and was sold to the general public under the maker's name. The store brand did not follow the real gun. In that case, the store brand came first. Strip away the model numbers, and what Ward's actually sold year after year was a very short list of very practical guns. There was the single-shot break-action shotgun, of which the Model 10 was the archetype. One barrel, one shell, an exposed hammer that had to be thumbed back deliberately before the gun would fire. It was the cheapest real shotgun a family could buy, and for that reason, the gun that taught more American boys to hunt than any other kind. It was also, not coincidentally, the safest possible gun to hand a child. With one shell in it, there was no such thing as a forgotten second round, and the hammer had to be cocked by hand every time. A father could see, from 30 feet away, whether that gun was ready to fire. There was the bolt-action shotgun, Mossberg's specialty, and something close to a lost category today. 2 or 3 shells in a magazine, worked by a bolt handle like a rifle. It was slower than a pump, and it was not elegant, and it did not care, because it was cheap to build, nearly impossible to break, and it patterned game just as dead. Many Western field bolt guns wore Mossberg's Select choke, an adjustable choke at the muzzle that let a man twist the collar to change his pattern from tight to open. One gun for ducks in the morning and rabbits in the afternoon. For a family that would only ever own one shotgun, that collar was not a gadget. It was the entire argument for the purchase. There was the pump gun, which is where the Model 550 and the Mossberg 500 come in. A repeater with real capacity, built to a price, and durable enough that a great many are still working the same fields 60 years on. And there was the .22 rifle, in bolt action and semi-automatic form, mostly from Mossberg, mostly cheap, and mostly bought for a specific child on a specific birthday. And there was the deer rifle, the lever action .336, wearing the name Western Field 33, and the bolt action Savage 1, 10 wearing the name Western Field 710. For the week in November, when a man took vacation days he could not really afford and went out to fill the freezer. Now consider how these guns reached people, because it is genuinely difficult to imagine now. For most of the period, a man in a farmhouse could open a catalog at his kitchen table, write out an order, put it in the mailbox at the end of his lane, and some weeks later a shotgun would arrive, by mail or railway express, in a crate or a cardboard box, addressed to him. Nobody asked him anything. No form, no dealer, no waiting period, no telephone call. The mailman brought it up the lane and set it on the porch. That was not a loophole. That was simply how the country worked, and it had worked that way since the 1800s, and to the people living inside it, it felt no stranger than ordering a saddle. And then, there is the price, which is where the whole thing lands. Take the verified figure, $25.90 for a Western Field Model 10 in 1957, against a federal minimum wage of $1 an hour, an assembly line wage of about $2.27 an hour, and a skilled tool and die wage of about $2.95 an hour. So, about 26 hours of work at the bottom of the wage scale, about 11 hours for a skilled tradesman, somewhere between a day and a half and 3 days of a man's labor. Now consider what that means. A working man in 1957 traded roughly 2 days of his life for an object. That object has now outlasted him by decades. It has outlasted the catalog it was ordered from, which stopped being printed in 1985. It has outlasted the company that sold it, which ceased to exist in the year 2001. It has outlasted the whole economy of small farms and small towns that made it necessary. And in tens of thousands of American households, it still works, not as an antique, as a shotgun. Open it, close it, and it locks up tight, because a case-hardened frame and a lockwork with almost nothing in it to fail turns out to be a very hard thing to kill. That is not sentiment. That is the engineering outcome of building something plain, building a great many of them, and selling them to people who could not afford to replace them. The guns did not vanish all at once, and no single villain closed them out. 4 separate things happened, roughly at the same time, and together, they ended the era. The first was the law. On the 22nd of October, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Gun Control Act of 1968. Among many other provisions, it effectively ended the direct mail-order sale of firearms to private citizens. From that point forward, firearm crossing state lines to a private buyer had to go through a federally licensed dealer. The mailbox at the end of the lane was closed. The context is a matter of record and needs no editorializing. The push for the legislation had begun after 1963, when the rifle used to kill President Kennedy was traced to a mail-order purchase made through a magazine advertisement. It gained decisive momentum in 1968, following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April and of Robert Kennedy in June. Whatever one concludes about the law, its effect on this story is simply stated. The specific thing Montgomery Ward had been built to do, take an order by mail from a man in the country and ship him the goods, could no longer legally be done with a gun. The second was liability, which followed close behind. Selling firearms stopped being an ordinary retail proposition and became a specialized one, with licensing, record-keeping, compliance, and legal exposure attached. For a company selling refrigerators and children's clothes and lawn furniture in hundreds of buildings, a department that generated paperwork and risk out of proportion to its revenue became hard to defend in a budget meeting. No verified date exists for when Montgomery Ward stopped selling firearms, and none will be invented here. What can be said is that across the 1970s and 80s, the gun counters thinned out and then quietly went away. Not by proclamation, but the way things usually end in retail, one store and one buying decision at a time. The third was competition, and it was the one that actually killed the company. Ward's had been the pioneer, but after the Second World War, its leadership grew cautious at precisely the wrong moment. Under Sewell Avery, the company declined to invest heavily in new stores, just as America emptied out of the cities into the suburbs and built its shopping around the automobile. Sears built. Ward's hesitated. It never recovered the lead. Then the discounters arrived, and the arithmetic Ward's had invented in 1872 was used against it. Target and Walmart went after the same customer with the same logic. Enormous volume, thin margins, low prices, but with modern distribution and no legacy catalog to support. The fourth was time itself, and it came for the catalog. In 1985, Montgomery Ward closed its catalog business after 113 years. That is worth sitting with. The catalog was not a division of the company. The catalog was the company. The original idea, printed on a single sheet of paper in a city still rebuilding from a fire. It had reached farms with no roads and towns with no stores. And in 1985, it stopped. The rest reads as a slow institutional death. Mobil had taken a controlling interest in 1974 and bought the company outright in 1976. Management took it private in a leveraged buyout worth $3.8 billion in March of 1988, loading it with debt at the worst possible moment. It filed for bankruptcy protection in 1997 and emerged in August of 1999 as a subsidiary of General Electric Capital. That reprieve lasted about 16 months. On the 28th of December, in the year 2000, 3 days after Christmas, Montgomery Ward announced that it was closing. 250 remaining stores, 37,000 employees. The liquidation ran into 2001, and Sears, of all companies, bought 18 of the buildings that March. 129 years after a salesman in Chicago mailed out a price list, the first great mail-order house in America was finished. The name survives now only as a trademark, bought and sold, attached to a website that has nothing to do with the company that built it. Here is the strange part, and it is the part that makes this story worth telling, rather than merely recording. The company is gone. The catalog is gone. The stores are parking lots and self-storage, and here and there, a converted building with the old brick still showing. The guns are not gone. They are in closets behind winter coats. They are in gun cabinets in basements in Ohio, standing next to something newer and more expensive that gets carried less. They are behind the seat of a truck in Alabama. They are above the door in a hunting camp in Pennsylvania that 4 generations of one family have used. They came out of estates and went to grandsons. They got handed across kitchen tables the way they were first bought at kitchen tables, and they still work. A gun that cost 2 days of a man's wages in 1957 has now put in 7 decades and is, in a great many cases, entirely serviceable. What are they worth in money? Honesty is better than flattery here. The National Rifle Association's own American rifleman, writing about the Western Field Model 10, put it directly. There has been very little interest in collecting Montgomery Ward guns, regardless of rarity, and prices are set by the shooting value of the gun rather than by any collector value. That should not be dressed up. These are not investment pieces. They were never meant to be. They were built to a price for people who had to think about the price. But there is a real and rising countercurrent, and it comes straight from the decoder. Because once a person knows that a Western Field 550 is a Mossberg 500, and that a Western Field 33 is a Marlin 336, and that a Western Field 710 is a Savage 110, the gun stops being an orphan. Parts fit, manuals apply, gunsmiths know it. A stock, a magazine tube, an extractor, a firing pin, all of it exists off the shelf. Because the parent gun was made in the millions, and in some cases is still being made right now. That is why people chase the maker codes, not to flip the gun, to keep it running, and it produces the moment anyone who has spent time around these guns has watched happen. A man brings in something his father left him, apologetic about it, half expecting to be told it is a cheap old catalog gun of no consequence. Somebody turns it over, finds the small factory marking the retailer never bothered to grind off, and tells him what it actually is, and his face changes. Not because the gun got more valuable, because his father, who bought the cheapest gun on the page because it was what he could manage that year, turns out to have brought home something built by one of the best plain gun makers in America. He did better than he knew. Most of them did. That is the quiet dignity in this story. Millions of American families bought guns from a department store catalog because they could not afford anything else. And what came in the mail was very often a first-rate working firearm with the wrong name on it. The name on the barrel was a marketing decision. The steel underneath was made by Mossberg in New Haven, by Savage and Stevens, by Marlin, by people who had been building guns since before the First World War, and who did not know how to build a bad one just because the order came from a store. Aaron Montgomery Ward's original idea was that an ordinary person a long way from anywhere deserved good goods at a fair price. For about a century, in this one narrow category, that idea worked exactly as intended. The catalog is closed. The company is dissolved. The men who paged through it at their kitchen tables, weighing $25.90 against everything else that money had to do, are mostly gone now too. The gun is still in the closet, and it still works. If you have one, look at it closely. The maker left his mark on it somewhere. He usually did. Subscribe for more stories behind the names stamped on the steel.